Anthem has finally been released, but I thought I'd wait a few weeks before commenting on it too much, and I didn't want to rush my review. I've been following the Anthem discussion both pre and post-release, but find that a number of outlets seem to be putting out more articles and videos regarding the problems with the game than actually playing it, regurgitating what's seen as common knowledge without perhaps experiencing enough of it for themselves. Now, for anybody who follows gaming, it will be almost impossible to have not heard of all the problems that Anthem has had, both technically and in its game design, and most of these complaints are valid, but the game does several things well and they deserve to be spoken about. Now, I'm hoping to have another video out soon discussing the issues and challenges these looter shooters tend to have in common as well. Creating these sorts of games is a hell of a lot harder than it is creating videos criticizing them. So let's discuss Anthem, what its problems are, what it does well, what improvements are needed in the short term, the long term, and what should have already been there. Can Bioware's Anthem improve, and can it be the pinnacle of the looter shooter? Can it evolve into something truly amazing in the future? So pick your favorite javelin and let's blast our way around this new world. Let's kick the review off quickly speaking about the graphics before discussing the more interesting and more important aspects of Anthem. The game is stunning, it's just that simple. The javelins and the game world look fantastic, with special mention going to the lighting, which just looks gorgeous at times. Water and foliage has great detail and helps bring the world to life, especially when you dive under the water. Weapons and enemies look very good too, as does the effects being thrown around on screen. Now, having played the game on the Xbox One X, I would like the frame rate to be a locked 30 frames a second, as the frame rate can drop at times when a lot is happening on screen, and hopefully Bioware can continue to improve the performance. One only has to look at this footage to see the game is gorgeous, so let's move on to more pressing issues surrounding this game. So the technical issues that were plaguing this game at launch were completely unacceptable, to be honest. The amount of technical problems I faced and still do simply confirms to me that Anthem needed another 6 months in development, and that is just to fix these issues and have the game run more stable across all platforms. The game needs content for sure, and I'll get to that later, but playing the game at release for almost any amount of time could make players see this game was released way too early. I had several connection issues trying to load into the game, and sometimes I would finally get in, but it would see me disconnected and return to the home screen to try again. The game froze several times during play. I've had the audio bug several times where the audio would simply cut out. But what's more interesting is that this has been in the last week, after patches have been issued. To make sure it was a bug with the game, I tested the TV sound, the sound system, and the headphones, and sound wasn't being played in any of them. Sounds from navigating the system menus and playing recorded clips were all okay and fine, and only a restart of Anthem would see the problem fixed within the game. It's slightly frustrating when just beginning a mission or a stronghold when you need to play the game in complete silence. Disconnections were also happening during play, which made completing missions take longer than it needed to, and that brings me to perhaps my main complaint about the game, and that is the load times. Whether this is due to the Frostbite engine itself, or EA stipulating to Bioware that they must use his engine, which isn't very well suited to open world games, but load times this frequently and for this long is just incredibly disappointing in 2019. So often you're just starting to get into a groove of flying around the world, exploring caves and doing world events, but it's as if Anthem is just stalking you, waiting to rip you out of this comfortable state you're in with an unnecessary load screen. Getting load screens during open play and during missions kills the idea that this is some huge open world. In one mission during the campaign, you're asked to open several tombs, and if you've played the game, I'll discuss the huge problem with this mission soon. But opening the tomb sees you hit with another loading screen. The tomb is almost a single, simple, open room. You are in this tomb so briefly, then it's another loading screen to go back out. Finishing missions also sees players kicked out of the world to the end mission screen, where players get to have a look at how their level is progressing, the items and weapons they've earned from the mission, and the experience they've earned ranking up the several alliances. But Anthem doesn't go into enough depth in explaining exactly what these mean and the benefit players get from ranking them up. From this screen, it's another load screen to go to the Forge, where you equip any new gear or weapons, then onto Fort Tarsus to accept another mission or launch free play or strongholds. Why Anthem had this design is completely lost on me. For missions I can understand it more, but for example, why do I need to exit from free play, load back to Fort Tarsus, only then to load into a stronghold or another free play area? At any time in game, players should be able to open the world map and head to the activity they wish without being hit by at least 3 loading screens. One from exiting and loading into the end mission screen, then a load to Fort Tarsus or the Forge, then a load from Fort Tarsus into the next activity. Again, it just makes the game feel so fractured for players to play. Mid-mission load screens also happen more than I'd like, and that's on top of the loading associated when needing to catch up to teammates. Sitting through a long load screen upon entering the world, then having a warning come up saying you're too far behind your team and need to catch up to them. And that means another load screen. I've spoken enough about the loading problem with the game now, but it's a large issue with it that many players will just need to accept, as I don't see it changing at all, even with patches. The menu system should be accessible from within these loading screens, and the Forge should be a part of it. Players could inspect their gear and make changes, but also read the information from the codexes. Reading these whilst the loading screen is happening is the perfect way to learn more about the world, enemies, and the history of everything in the game. Now let's take a look at the campaign and the missions within the game. I found the main story campaign enjoyable, without it being particularly memorable. Having the majority of the narrative being told around Fort Tarsus by speaking with characters felt like it was a little bit of a missed opportunity to have more story content happen out in this fantastic world which was built. Bioware has done a good job with fleshing out the characters and their personalities, even though this isn't on the same level as the original Mass Effect trilogy in terms of character development or story. And on a side note, be sure to check out my Mass Effect Trilogy review to find out how much I adore those games. Even with the hype associated with Anthem, I never once thought that Bioware could create story and characters on the level of Mass Effect while also being a loot-based game. The Monitor, as a villain, is serviceable, but much of the motivations behind what he's doing doesn't quite hit the highs I was after. Anthem could have benefited much more from simply having a longer campaign and fleshing out the ideas and the characters even more. This isn't full of plot twists or emotional moments that you'll remember for years to come, but I did enjoy it, and it did just enough to keep my interest over the playtime. But I hope Bioware really expands upon the story, the characters, and how they tell Anthem's story in future updates. And that includes our own relationships with these characters and how that impacts the future of Fort Tarsus. But now to discuss that tomb mission I mentioned earlier. This is the type of mission that should never make its way into the main campaign of any game. It's a complete grind to accomplish the task required to open these tombs in order to progress this story further. This is simply poor design and artificial padding that's completely unnecessary and takes away from the game and adds nothing. This is a part of the grinding aspect of these types of games and are often done as side activities or part of the end game, but to include these within the single player story, and especially from a developer such as Bioware, is just disappointing. More interesting missions could have been added to enhance the story and characters, and I expect much more from Bioware, who has such a rich history in crafting stories, worlds, and the characters which inhabit them. Now, players are also able to acquire side missions from NPCs at the fort in the form of agent contracts from the 3 different factions of the Freelancers, the Sentinels, and the Arcanists. These missions are often multi-step and cross over with other contracts, and they are a good addition to the game and another way for players to level up their Javelin. Once again, they don't do anything particularly new or interesting in terms of their storytelling or the tasks players undertake within them. Daily contracts can also be acquired, and this will see players replay the same missions repeatedly in the hopes of receiving better gear, and is quite common in loot-based games. Daily, weekly, and monthly challenges are also on offer. More variety in these is needed, as they are simply completing activities or tasks such as the beating of strongholds or killing a number of certain enemies. The strongholds are dungeon type activities, and it would be great for Bioware to include daily and weekly changes to them in the form of modifiers on top of the daily and weekly challenges already offered. I'll be going into much more detail regarding this idea with part 2 of this Anthem review, where I dive into the current and the future of the endgame. There are also world activities players can participate in, such as fighting titans or helping other AI-controlled freelancers defeat enemies, but again, there needs to be more variety in these activities. For example, why aren't the Striders walking around the environment as we saw in the E3 2017 footage? Have them get attacked by a huge number of enemies and have it be a large open world event that players can be alerted to, where they can earn activity-specific loot. And speaking of other players, the open world really needs more than 3, as playing solo can be quite lonely, especially when trying to defeat a titan on your own for 15 minutes. In an effort to infuse more story and meaning behind the player's actions, Bioware included dialogue choices, and many conversations can be had with the NPCs which populate Fort Tarsus, but these feel more of a novelty than having any real meaningful impact on the story's direction or further character development. Not as in-depth as Mass Effect in terms of choices, and nowhere near as interesting either, I found myself skipping a lot of the dialogue after extended playtime, as I just wanted to accept the mission and move on. Had some of these interactions happened in the open world, then perhaps they would have felt a little more meaningful and interesting. Now we need to talk about the loot within the game. Anthem is in desperate need of a far larger and more interesting loot table. Receiving the same weapons over and over again, just as a more powerful version with different perks, makes them less interesting each time. Players will have access to sniper and assault rifles, pistols, shotguns, marksman rifles, but weapons don't really start to get interesting until you hit close to max level and start to earn the masterwork and legendary gear. Now, the more common weapons and less interesting ones happen in all loot games when starting out. It's just a part of looter shooters. But when earning the same weapon at level 1 and at level 30, just as a more powerful version, one does think that Bioware needs to add much more variety into the game. In Anthem, players also grind for class abilities and different grenade types for their javelins, and being able to change these abilities does impact the playstyle, and I quite like how Bioware made these a part of the loot instead of having certain abilities tied to certain classes. But once again, there needs to be much more variety in the rewards that players receive. The game also rewards players with quite a large amount of loot when compared to other games, but as I mentioned in a previous video, which I'll link down below, there is a fine line between what makes the player feel rewarded and what doesn't. For example, being rewarded with dozens of duplicate items with little difference will see players grow tired of chasing much of the loot. But reward them with too little, and players can grow frustrated with their time not being respected. I would have liked to see different types of armor awarded to the player as well, as this would have provided more items to grind for, plus being able to customize the look of our javelins more, than just changing the color and type, which I admit is a very welcome addition to the game though. The rewards given must be coveted by the player, and Bioware needs to work on this a lot more. An extreme example of what I mean by this is how many players reacted to the original Destiny when rewarded with weapons such as Thorn or Gjallarhorn. Players would freak out when receiving these rewards, as they were so highly prized, Anthem doesn't need to go to this extent, but in addition to a larger weapon pool, it needs more memorable weapons that players can chase within it. With so much loot given out, duplicates need to become less and less common unless they can be used for other purposes apart from simply breaking them down for resources. A larger weapon perk pool is also needed so players can grind for even the same weapon and be confident that it will have a different worthwhile role, but also worth keeping. Crafting also makes an appearance in the game, where players can craft weapons from blueprints they find or are rewarded with. Materials are needed for this, which can be gained from dismantling unwanted weapons and collecting various materials in the open world that go towards making them. What is needed to create each weapon is told to the player in the menu system, but doing some of this will be a long grind, so don't expect for them to come easily or quickly. And now that I'm speaking about what players can receive from playing, how is the gameplay and the combat? This is one area of Anthem where I think Bioware has done a great job. Earlier in my review, I mentioned perhaps the greatest problem with Anthem is the loading time, but in my opinion, Anthem's greatest success is its gameplay. To put it simply, flying around and shooting enemies in the face is incredibly satisfying. The flight controls and how your javelin feels when flying around this beautiful world is fantastic. Watching your jet start to warm up from continual flight, watching them almost overheating, only to make your javelin fly through a waterfall or diving into a body of water to cool them down, allowing you to fly longer. Even after dozens of hours of play, this is still so satisfying to do. And then there is the combat and the agility of your javelin. Firing your weapons from on the ground or in the air, switching between them, throwing grenades and putting down a shield to protect yourself or others, and finishing off an enemy with an aerial melee attack makes the combat fun, fast, and just makes me want to keep playing. Each of the weapon types have their own feel and all feel great to shoot, plus each of the weapons has differences even within the same type. Shooting a fast firing sniper rifle that can shoot multiple bullets before needing a reload is completely different to shooting another sniper rifle such as the Devastator, a single shot weapon that deals a large amount of damage with its explosive payload. Bioware needs to continue this trend on top of having more weapons, have even more differences between these weapons within the same class, and then add some really interesting perks that can be attached to them. The inclusions of combos to the combat adds another layer of depth, which becomes more important on higher difficulty settings, especially if you're playing in a team that you can communicate with. Using primers and detonators to inflict greater damage on the enemies is a good inclusion to the game. And speaking of playstyles, each of the 4 javelins of the Ranger, Interceptor, Colossus and Storm are very different to players, and I hope Bioware, along with adding new javelins, make the differences between them even greater. The agility of the Interceptor compared to the tank-like Colossus, the all-round Ranger, or the ability-rich Storm, each adds something different to a team and each are enjoyable to play as, with most of my playtime being with the Ranger. The inclusion of 6 different difficulty levels also adds more to the game and gives players more options in how difficult they want their playtime to be. Increasing the difficulty sees enemies become much tougher, but also better loot drops, but will also require a team of highly skilled players, better equipped javelins, and more communication. I found the game became more enjoyable once I bumped the difficulty up to hard when leveling up, then onto Grandmaster 1 once I leveled into the late 20s, which saw better weapons drop, and overall, it was a more enjoyable experience. There are also Grandmaster 2 and 3 difficulty levels, and I'm sure Bioware will add further difficulty settings over time, plus tweak the existing difficulty of those as well. Anthem is a game that will grow over time, but that doesn't excuse it from the problems it has had over the launch period. I have had a great time with the game so far, even despite these problems, but the game should not have been released in its current state unless it was in beta. Gameplay is fun and shooting and flying always feels fantastic, but the game is too light on content, even when making your way to max level, but especially with the endgame, which I'll get to in my next part of the video. Bioware has created a fantastic game world, but somehow forgot to fill it with much more content. Other games such as Destiny 1 and 2, Warframe, The Division and Diablo can all be looked towards to see the problems they had and what was needed to avoid the same pitfalls. Technical issues can happen once games are released, as it's a different situation to in-house testing or even an alpha or beta test. But things like long load times and having the content people expect both in quality and quantity would have been known that it was lacking. Anthem is in a tough spot right now, but I still enjoy playing the game and can see a very good future for it if Bioware make the necessary changes. Be sure to check out part 2 of my review where I discuss the end game and what is needed for Anthem to not only grow, but compete in the looter shooter gaming space.